At this point, it makes sense to pause and sort of think a little bit about a major transition that happens in Jewish history that really colors the experience of Jews and the globe, really, and that is, of course, the diaspora. The term diaspora is Greek in origin, and it means something like scattering, and it refers to the spreading out of Jews into the Mediterranean basin and Mesopotamia and eventually throughout the world. This has been the Jewish experience for the last 2,000 years. It's only been dramatically altered with the establishment of the State of Israel in the middle of the 20th century. So, really, we're speaking about the biggest chunk of Jewish history in the post-biblical period has been all in diaspora, and Jews negotiated their reality politically, socially, economically, and so on as a minority in majority cultures. And that certainly had a lot to say about what kind of people the Jews would become. Now, we should note, of course, that the term that was used internally within the Jewish world, at least until the 19th century in particular, was not diaspora, which has kind of like a neutral connotation, but the word exile. In Hebrew, galut, or in a Ashkenazic pronunciation, galus. That Jews were thrown out of their land. And this is a little bit of a misnomer because although there was tremendous devastation and suffering in the wake of the destruction of the temple, and there was an expulsion of Jews from Jerusalem in particular, they were not actually expelled from the land in the first century like they were with the also limited population transfers that happened under the Assyrians and the Babylonians. They were, let's say, highly encouraged to leave by the desperate conditions. In some cases, there were tens of thousands taking off into slavery, but the concept of expelling all the Jews from their land is something that really wasn't considered reasonable in the ancient world at all. So there was always a Jewish presence within the land of Israel, sometimes an incredibly small population, but nevertheless, Jews always did maintain some kind of physical presence in the land of Israel throughout the long 2 millennia of diaspora. However, the majority of the Jewish population soon found themselves outside of the boundaries of traditional Israel, hence the experience as a galut, as an exile nation. It's worthy pointing out, not in this particular series, but just in one sentence, that the concept of exile on a theological level pertains even when the Jews have returned to their land and have a state, meaning theologically, Jews consider themselves still in exile, even if they're living in Jerusalem today. There is a concept that until the Messiah comes, there will be a diasporic or an exilic condition pertaining to Jewish existence. But at any rate, let us take some of our time and look at the diaspora in antiquity, both before the destruction of the temple and maybe a little bit after the destruction of the temple, before we move into the medieval period. Here's a map that gives you a sense of the diaspora after the Bar Kokhba rebellion. You'll recall that the first Roman-Jewish war in the year 70 resulted in the destruction of the temple in that year and ultimately the fall of Masada. And as we shall see, there was definitely dispersion of Jews within Israel itself, but the process of Jews settling throughout the Mediterranean basin and in Mesopotamia had begun centuries earlier. On this map, you see the kind of hatched lines that encircle the Mediterranean refer to the greatest extent of the Roman Empire, which would have been in the early 2nd century. And every dot that represents a city indicates that there was a Jewish population after the Bar Kokhba rebellion in the 2nd century. Have a look at Israel closely here, and you can see that the hatching shows that there was a Jewish settlement along the coast, a little bit towards the northern Negev, and heavily based in the Galil to the north, and also a little bit in the Jordan Valley on both sides of the river in the Perea region as well. But conspicuous by its absence, of course, is the region around Judea, which is emptied of Jews because of the Roman attacks on the Bar Kokhba rebels and the destruction of Jewish villages there. a lot of Jewish population moved, in particular north to where the new center would exist, and Jews were in fact banned from Jerusalem at this time as well. The Romans also changed the name of the land. This is when it received the Latin term Palestina, which was intended to refer to the biblical enemies of the Jews in the land of Israel, the Philistines, Plishtim in Hebrew, and so renaming the region Palestina was meant to try and, in terms of cartography, wipe Israel off the map, so to speak. It is ironic, of course, that the term has been revived as a political term. It has always been a geographic term since the Roman Empire, though. Jews were also living in Mesopotamia, that is this region here, framed by the flow of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers into the Persian Gulf. We'll look at that in the next lecture. And then there's a certain amount of Jews who are living in the Italian and in the Greek peninsulas and in Asia Minor as well, in the Eastern Mediterranean. We also have Jews who are living in the coast of North Africa. We looked at one of those communities, Kyrene, in the context of the Kitos Rebellion a little while ago, and there are even Jews as far west as the Iberian Peninsula and the south of France as well. So we're going to look at all of these, however briefly, in the next couple of lectures. But the main center of the Jewish diaspora at this period of time was undoubtedly Egypt, a very, very important place where Jews had been living literally for centuries. There was a long connection between Israel and Egypt after the Exodus. The Bible describes many relations between Egypt and Israel, quite often hostile and quite often not hostile. For example, King Solomon marries an Egyptian princess, and Isaiah refers to communities in Lower Egypt. Jeremiah spends some time there, unwillingly as it happens, after the assassination of Gedaliah, for whom there is a fast day after Rosh Hashanah every year since then. The Jews were primarily concentrated in the southern region in the earliest period. That is down at the bottom. You'll see the town Elephantine. Now, I always pronounce that, by the way, Elephantine, until I looked a little more carefully, and I think it's supposed to be pronounced Elephantine. Maybe someone in the comments will correct me if I get that wrong. This is known as the Upper Nile. Even though it is on the bottom of the map, as I think I mentioned to you earlier, the Nile, of course, flows to the north. It empties into the Mediterranean Sea. And so therefore, upriver, which is south, is called the Upper Nile, and downriver is the Lower Nile, where you have, the cities of Cairo and Alexandria and so on. So there is a very important a Jewish military colony in Elephantine, and we're going to look at that in just a second. And it may go back, the roots of that settlement are somewhat under dispute, but it may go back as early as the 7th century before the Common Era, when King Manasseh of Judah had relations with Egypt and sent a colony there. So let's look a little more carefully at that particular settlement. Here's a satellite view of the Nile River. You can see the green represents obviously the tremendous irrigation power of the Nile. And down at the very south, where you see that little red part, there are some cataracts, which means that the river constricts and it loses its depths, and ships moving toward the north have to find a way to unload their cargo or negotiate the rapids or put it on the land in a kind of portage situation. And so that's a really dangerous spot for any kind of transition, and that's where robbers would lie in wait and so on. Hence, it makes sense to have some kind of military outpost there. Now, we know a little bit about this community because the records were preserved in papyri and in ostraca, right? Those bits of clay shards. We know that the Jews had a temple there. And it's interesting that they would have some kind of temple, because after all, the Bible is pretty clear about prohibiting any other temples outside of Jerusalem, but there were actually 3 other temples in existence in the destruction in the Second Temple period. We have one in Shechem, which is Nablus in modern terminology, and in Samaria. That would be the Samaritan temple, of course, which regular Judahite Jews would not consider, of course, valid. The Arak el Amir in Jordan, and Leontopolis, which would be in Egypt, under Chunya. He's referred to as Chunya in the Talmud, Onias IV. So what is going on in those temples is fascinating, but a little bit beyond our area of exploitation today. We have in these records some interesting records of women, for example. Here's my chance to fill in the blocks and check off the Kranjak test. We have one very wealthy woman who owns several homes and things like that. Her name is Mibtachia, which seems to be related to the word batach, meaning to trust, to have faith in God. She was married 3 times, first to a Jewish soldier, and then apparently to 2 type of construction engineers, or maybe architects. They're called builders. Maybe there were local quarries or something in the region, not clear. Another fascinating archive refers to a man named Anania, who was a temple official, Jewish, who married an Egyptian slave named Tamut. Tamut is definitely not a Hebrew name, because in Hebrew the word Tamut means she will die, right? That's probably not a good name for your daughter. So the fact that he's marrying an Egyptian slave is in itself bizarre, but you also see from the documents that in fact he wasn't even completely married to her in a Jewish sense, that it was certainly does not follow any of the laws as described in the Talmud, because she was simultaneously owned by a different man, her master, someone named Meshulam, which is also a Jewish name. And he, in fact, owned their son, whose name was Pilti. If Anania were to default in the relationship and ask for a divorce, then Meshulam, the owner of the slave woman, will get the child. The whole thing is really bizarre. Also interesting, though, again, pretty much in contradiction to Jewish law, Tamut could just start a divorce on her own, which is something that rabbinic law does not permit. Lots more to say about that. I hope to come back to it in maybe in the medieval period when we look at women in Jewish law. At any rate, fascinating details about families and existence in Elephantine, and there's even some fascinating archaeological discoveries of the actual site of the temple itself. Another major center of Jewish settlement in Egypt and the early diaspora is Alexandria, which of course is a big city today. In the western part of the Nile Delta, you can see where it is here, right on the coast. The Jews of Alexandria go back centuries and centuries. In the 3rd century before the Common Era, Jews were involved in translating the Bible into Greek, making it available to the broader Mediterranean society. This had an incredibly influential role in promulgating the ideas of Judaism, and was especially influential in the early church. There's a funny story about how the Septuagint was written. According to the legend, 70 rabbis were brought in, and they were all put in 70 different rooms and given the Bible and told to translate it, and they all came out and compared what they had done, and they had all written the exact same translation. They had all essentially agreed with each other. Rabbi Hutner, who was a very important Rosh Hashiva in America, he liked to joke that, you call that a miracle? That's not a miracle. If you get 70 rabbis together and you put them in one room and ask them to agree on anything, that's a miracle, right? Anyways, I thought that was funny. By the 1st century, Jews were quite numerous in Alexandria, and they had one neighborhood which was specifically the Jewish neighborhood, and they had a second one out of 5 neighborhoods that they were populating as well. But there was a significant amount of controversy with the local Greek population. You recall that Alexander the Great had swept through the entire region and had established all kinds of new norms and new cities. Alexander, that's not a coincidence. And there are a lot of people who had privileges under the Greek regime, under Ptolemy, but when the Romans came, they were not happy with the displacement that occurred as a result of new management. Jews, on the other hand, saw it as a potential for them to increase their status and their privileges in a new society. And so Jews actually welcomed the Roman armies when they arrived in the middle of the first century before the Common Era. We have a fascinating description of a major upheaval against the Jews in the year 38, which some have called actually the first pogrom. This was recorded by the philosopher Philo, very important Jewish thinker of the era, who approached the Bible primarily in the Greek sense with the Septuagint. Philo was extremely important in introducing a new philosophical way to understand the Bible. He did not get that much traction in the Jewish tradition. He did not write in Hebrew, he wrote in Greek, and many of his ideas were really quite contrary to much of what the rabbis were talking about, but nevertheless extremely influential once again on the Christian tradition, not so much on the Jewish tradition. At any rate, he describes this first upheaval as the result of the tensions between the Greek and the Jewish populations in the city that were exacerbated in particular when King Agrippa I, you remember him, he ruled in the middle of the first century for a few years, and he visited the region. Jews locally asked him if he would maybe intercede with his friends in Rome on their behalf. He chose unwisely to have a kind of a gaudy parade through the town of Alexandria, and the Greek rivals of the Jews actually mounted sort of like a mock counter parade in which they openly made fun of Agrippa I, and sure enough, it eventually translated into violence against the Jews. The local procurator, who had his own issues with Rome, even though he was a Roman official, there was a change of the guard in Rome, and he was concerned about his own position, and he decided to take the side of the Greeks, and he ordered, among other things, that the Jews should be limited to one neighborhood, not to two. And the forced concentration of Jews into one of those two neighborhoods, which some would argue actually constituted the world's first ghetto, interesting idea, was also occasioned by significant anti-Jewish violence and attacks on synagogues, which was really an unusual thing for the ancient world. Synagogues were generally considered, places where you should not transgress and you should respect the various ritual worship of other groups. But this was one of those occasions where that was ignored. The new emperor, however, laid down the law and established the status quo ante, where the Jews were, mollified, but there would be yet again violence in the year 66, probably in connection with the Roman-Jewish War that exploded in that year. So that's just a look very quickly at Alexandria. And as a whole, Egypt played a very important role in the early diaspora. Thank you very much for watching.